Hello, everyone. Welcome. I think we have enough folks on to get started here. I'm Jordan. I'm a third-year student, definitely going into IM and then probably into nephrology. We're going to be talking about hyponatremia today. My goal is to make this feel at least a little bit intuitive. We have a QR code up with a URL there for the slides that you can download to look through. But I just want to start off with a brief disclaimer. So first is that I love this topic. I think it's one of the most challenging conceptually topics that we cover in the first 2 years of medical school. And I remember sort of sitting there after the lectures and struggling with it. So it's large and it's conceptually challenging. And what I want to do tonight is to tell you like an incomplete story, rather than going into detail on every one of the pathophysiologic bases or etiologies that can give rise to hyponatremia. I want to instead give you a conceptual framework that you can use to make this topic feel intuitive. And so to that end, I have this kind of strange looking slide set up. On the left here, we're going to put reminders of the concepts we establish and talk about. We're going to do some questions, and then we'll answer those questions. And then just for fun, and because I'm one of the founders of AI in Medicine at Jefferson, we're also going to include some AI art just to spice things up a little bit. So I want to illustrate why it is that hyponatremia feels so difficult. And we're going to do it with an example, and I want to make that example somewhat vivid. So I want you to imagine for a moment you're a peasant living in the Middle Ages, and your village elders tell you to go on a quest to fetch a magical orb at the top of a mountain. So you find your way up the mountain, fighting through the torrential downpours and thunder, and you arrive at the top to see a dark figure guarding the orb. It turns and casts a spell on you. Okay, so with that as our setup, let's answer the first question here. I can tell you that a normal magnesium level is 1.2 millimoles per liter. And what that dark figure you encountered is actually a magnesium mage. And they have cast a spell that vanished 50% of your magnesium. So 50% is gone. Every pair of molecules becomes just one. The question I have for you is, if I were to take a sample of your blood and measure the new concentration of magnesium, what would it be? Take a moment, decide on your answer. If you can, write it down so you really commit. And then I can reveal, hopefully some of you selected the correct answer, which is B, 0.6 millimoles per liter. There's not going to be too much math in this presentation, but a little bit. You divide 1.2 in half and you get 0.6. Okay. Straightforward. Makes sense. But let's wind that back and replace our magnesium mage with a sodium sorcerer. And here, the sorcerer casts a spell that vanishes 50% of your sodium. I can tell you again, a normal sodium level is about 140 milliequivalents per liter. And, of course, this would lead quickly to your death. But putting that aside, let's imagine I now take a new sample of your blood and measure the serum sodium concentration. What is going to be the correct answer? Pick one of the options here. Maybe write it down or say it out loud so that you've committed to one. And hopefully some of you picked the correct wrong answer, which is B. It's not 70 milliequivalents per liter. Even though we divided that 140 in half, even though half of it is gone, the real answer is probably closer to 117. And the reason that's the case is the reason both sodium is important and also that it's so hard to wrap your head around, right? Sodium balance is difficult because sodium has an important job, which is that it's the major extracellular osmol. It's the thing outside of the cells that's controlling the volume of that water compartment. So when you have changes in sodium concentration, the water will move around in response to that, right? Let's illustrate that with an example. You may remember something like this from chemistry class, where you had a beaker, some water in the beaker, and a semi-permeable membrane that let the water go through, but what it didn't let through was the solute you had dissolved in that water. Okay, so beaker, water, semi-permeable membrane, and solute. And let's have our sodium sorcerer come in for an in-class experiment that casts the spell and vanishes 50% of that solute. What happens? Well, we've got more solute on the left than the right. So there's going to be an osmotic gradient that's going to pull water across. And so we see that over time, water diffuses across this membrane, and you have more water on the left than the right, and you have an equalization in the concentration of these two solutes. You may have heard this expression, water follows salt. That's great. I think a better expression, although perhaps less pithy, is water follows osmotically active molecules. Okay. Now, in reality, because there's a little bit of hydrostatic pressure on the left compared to the left may be slightly more concentrated. You may have, fitting that in with like the physiology of the glomerulus or Starling's forces at the level of a capillary. But this idea is very important. So this is going to be our first concept, concept 1. Water shifts based on the concentration of effective osmoles. Looking at the chat here for questions. I don't see any questions just yet. That's great. So you may be asking, all right, that makes sense in a beaker, but what about in the body? Where does the water go in the body? And here we have to introduce the 3 body water compartments. 2/3 of your body water, of all the water in your body, is in the cells. Okay, a majority, 2/3, hiding within the cells. So the remaining third is outside of the cells, the extracellular volume. And of that extracellular volume, a quarter is in the vessels. So a quarter of that extracellular volume is within the vasculature, it's intravascular. Okay, so 1/12 of your total body water is in the vessels. Another question for you here. We have those 3 body water compartments, and each one has its own unique osmole that controls the volume of that space. So the question for you is, what is the key intracellular osmole? What is the key extracellular osmole outside of the cells? And what is the key intravascular osmole, the one that's responsible for keeping water within the vessels? Write down your answers. It's okay if you don't know, especially on that third one. You may not know. That's totally fine. Just try to stake out an answer. I can reveal the correct answer is for the intracellular compartment that is controlled by potassium. For the extracellular compartment, that's controlled by sodium, and the intravascular, which I'll remind you is a part of the extracellular. So sodium is also important to the intravascular, but it has its own effective osmole, albumin, that exerts that oncotic pressure to keep water in the intravascular space. Okay, we're not going to talk too much about albumin today. We're mostly going to be focusing on sodium and potassium, and really mostly on sodium. But just to give you a sense, here's that blown up image of those 3 compartments, the intracellular on the left, the extracellular on the right too, and then intravascular on the far right. And just to show you how incredibly different the concentrations are, this is drawn to scale. The number of little icons, a banana for potassium and a salt shaker for sodium, is showing you the relative concentrations. Okay, so if you're looking to find the total body sodium, you're going to look outside of the cells. That's where it is. And if you're looking for all the potassium in the body, it's inside the cells. Okay, different atmospheres. So here we have our 3 components. And what I want to show you is just how big these are relative to each other. Drawn to scale. Here they are drawn to scale. And you can see dominating everything is that intracellular compartment. And look at how small the intravascular space is. That is the only thing the kidney gets to see. In fact, that any of the organs get to see is that intravascular space. And by fiddling with the concentrations of solutes and water, the kidney's job is going to be to control the concentrations of all of these compartments and their size. So pretty tall order. But the fact that there are 3 different solutes makes that a lot easier. Okay, so there's our second concept, that there are 3 compartments with potassium inside the cells, sodium outside the cells, and albumin within the vessels. Questions? Checking here in the chat. No questions, that's great. We're now going to get to, I think, the most, what I think is the most important idea from this entire lecture, which is that problems with serum sodium are water, and that problems with volume are based on how much sodium you have. And it's very counterintuitive. I call it a counterintuitive switch because I think it deserves a name. We're going to talk about this in 2 parts. Okay. 1, hyponatremia is a water problem. And 2, volume is a sodium problem. Let's dive into the hyponatremia being a water problem first, which you may have heard before. I don't know if you've heard the second part as much. So to illustrate this, we have 1/3 final version of our hypothetical example. And in this case, instead of it being a magnesium mage or a sodium sorcerer, we're going to have a water wizard. And I'll remind you, a normal sodium level is 140 milliequivalents per liter. But in this case, the wizard's going to cast a spell that's going to double the water in your body. Anywhere you find an H2O molecule, it maybe splits in half into 2 totally normal H2O molecules. It just twice as much water everywhere. And the question I have for you is, what will be the new concentration of sodium? Take a moment, commit to an answer, write it down. And I can tell you here the answer is, in fact, B. 70 milliequivalents per liter. Unlike before, in which we had this movement of water that reduced the impact of losing some of that sodium, here now, when we double the water, we see, in fact, that there is a halving of the serum sodium. Okay? How does that make sense? Well, we know that the concentration of anything in sodium here is the amount of that thing in the amount of solvent, the amount of sodium divided by the amount of water. So there's two ways you can have a reduction in the concentration of sodium. You could either have a reduction in the amount of sodium with water staying the same, or you could have the amount of sodium staying the same and an increase in the amount of water. And we had our two examples. And what we saw was the problem with the first explanation of reducing the amount of sodium with the water staying the same is that the water doesn't stay the same. When we reduce the sodium, water flows into the cells and increases our concentration. And so that's not the way to think about this, right? That doesn't explain so clearly why it is we have a low concentration. Instead, we can see that increasing the amount of water did, in fact, reduce the sodium concentration by 50%, right? When you increased that water, you didn't have any movement of sodium. And so that is the way to think about a decrease in serum sodium concentration, okay? I'm going to say it again because it's so important. Because sodium is the major extracellular osmol, and because we are all the same osmolality in all of our cells in the body, when you have a low concentration of sodium, what that means is too much water. And that means a low total body osmolality, a low concentration of stuff in the solvents of our body. Okay, great. So there we have our third concept, that hyponatremia is a water problem. Questions? Okay, I see a question here in the chat asking, how does the concentration of sodium differ from the total body sodium? Great question. And let's talk about it. Actually, very, very well-timed question. Let's talk about it as we go through this next section here on the other half of the counterintuitive switch. Oh, an objection. Goodness, I forgot to put this in. So losing sodium made water move. Why doesn't adding water make sodium move? I don't know if anyone had this objection, but the idea here that's key is to remember that our osmols are effective because they can't cross the plasma membrane. The reason they can't cross is because sodium and potassium are charged ions, and that lipid bilayer has a non-polar interior, so they can't cross. But we express aquaporin channels everywhere in the body, every cell, except for some exceptions we'll talk about in a little bit. But everywhere we express this aquaporin, so water happily moves. And so when you add water to the body, it doesn't make any of your ions change their location. But let's dive into this concept of the total body sodium and the idea of volume. Okay, so we just saw the hyponatremia as a water problem. And now we're going to talk about how volume is a sodium problem. To address this, we're going to do another question here. I want you to imagine you're giving a 1,000 milliliter bolus, so 1 liter of each of the following fluids. And what I want you to answer is how much of each is going to remain in the intravascular space. And you may have noticed slowly fading in there is a reminders of the relative sizes. I'll give you a hint. That is going to help you to get to the answer here. But really just both make a commitment to what you think the answer might be, see if you have any reason that, just sort of stake out a claim here. And then I'm going to show you the answers. So for whole blood, you keep every milliliter, 1,000 milliliters remains in the intravascular space. Of the normal saline, or in fact any crystalloid, 250 milliliters is going to remain in the intravascular space. And for the D5W, which is basically just free water, only 80 mils remains in the intravascular space. Let's look at why that's the case. Okay. So we know these fluids are going to distribute across your body differently. And for blood, I told you all of it's going to remain in the intravascular space. And the reason is because blood has our key intravascular osmol, it has albumin in it, right? And so that's going to hold on to water in the intravascular space, right? You're not constantly leaking blood, hopefully, into your interstitium. It's staying in the vessels. In contrast, we have the crystalloids, and these distribute across the extracellular compartment, right? They have sodium in them, so they can't go into the cells because the sodium exerts that oncotic pressure, like we saw at the beginning, not quite oncotic, osmotic pressure, excuse me, like we saw in our first concept, right? And so because the sodium can't get into the cells, The volume remains entirely in that extracellular compartment. And like we said, a quarter of the extracellular compartment is intravascular. So a quarter of your liter bolus remains in the intravascular space. You get 250 cc's, 250 milliliters of fluid remaining in the intravascular space. And then finally, our last example was the D5W. And remember, D5W is just free water. We would love to just give free water, but if we did that, all of our red blood cells would fill up with water and they would lyse and you'd have hemolysis and it would be a bad time. So we put in some dextrose, which very quickly is metabolized into glucose. And so that becomes free water in the body. And so it distributes, thanks to those aquaporin channels, across every compartment, right? So 2/3 disappears inside the cells, and that remaining third remains in the extracellular space. And of that remaining third, only a quarter is in the intravascular. And so that's just 8% or 80 cc's, right? And that is the reason that we say D5W isn't volume, is because so much of it disappears into the cells, we know it's only giving us a small amount in the intravascular space. It's not nearly as good as crystalloids or blood, okay? So why do we say volume is a sodium problem? We say it because of how bad water is at repleting the intravascular space. If you take that same water and you add sodium, you increase your benefit, right? By adding sodium, you have more volume than you did before. And it's significant, right? 80 mils turns into 250. It's 3 times as powerful because you've added some sodium there. And in fact, we can't do this, but if I were to take a syringe of pure sodium chloride and inject that into your blood vessels, what would happen is the extracellular compartment would increase its tonicity. It would pull water out of the cells and you would increase its volume when you went to go measure that volume, right? When we see edema, that's a result of having too much sodium in the body. That's what volume overload is. And diuretics work because they remove sodium from the body. For D5W, not effective volume repletion. So that question you had, how does the serum sodium concentration differ from the total body sodium, right? When we talk about volume status, we talk about total body sodium because it's the thing that's outside of the cells. And the volume we care about is the stuff inside the vessels, right? If we just give water, it's all going to disappear inside the cells. You're not going to get very much volume benefit, okay? We can talk about that. Hopefully that'll become even more clear as we move forward. But so this concept number 4, that volume is a sodium problem. Okay, looking for questions here. What is my cat's name? Excellent question. My cat's name is Shale. He's 4, and he's the vet said he's a good boy, so that's good. Thank you for asking. Any other questions here? No, I think we're doing okay. So let's move on. We have coming up now part 2. Regulating water and salt. So you may have heard a lot about this molecule over the last 2 weeks or so far, the ADH, the antidiuretic hormone, and stealing this directly from Joel Toff, who I will plug later, Kidney Boy on Twitter. It's confusing when things are named for what they don't do. So the antidiuretic hormone, it doesn't make you pee. So instead, like to refer to this as the adds hydration hormone, right? ADH adds hydration to the body by taking it from the urine. How does that work? So here we have our nephron, and we can see with this dotted line from the glomerulus all the way to the tip of the loop of Henle, we are permeable to water, just like the rest of the body, right? We constitutively express aquaporin channels, so water happily will follow along any osmotic gradient you establish and cross those barriers. But from the tip of the loop of Henle to the tip of your urethra, you are impermeable to water. There are no aquaporin channels there. I'm going to say that again because I think it's useful to remember when you're trying to keep track of what's permeable, what's not. From the tip of the loop of Henle to the tip of your urethra, that is impermeable to water. Okay, it's locked. Water cannot cross. But the tubules are special because they respond to ADH, which is the key that can unlock the tubules and allow water to be reabsorbed. Okay, so when it's unlocked, we have water being reabsorbed. And it's because the tubules are passing through that concentrated medullary interstitium that we're able to reabsorb so much water. But here's the thing. What we're reabsorbing is water, okay? D5W, free water. And that's going to distribute across all compartments. So we're only going to get 8% into the intravascular space, right? ADH adds hydration to the body by unlocking the tubules and allowing absorption of free water. Concept 5. And this sort of leads us directly into osmoregulation versus volume regulation. ADH is good at reducing osmolality because it's adding water to the body, okay? But what that means, because it's free water, only 8% into the intravascular space, it's bad at increasing volume, right? It doesn't add sodium, which means we're going to use it to control osmolality, as we saw in the previous concept, right? Reductions in serum sodium, reductions in serum osmolality is a result of changes in the concentration, in the amount of free water we have. I'll say that again. Changes in serum sodium are based on changes in the amount of free water, and ADH is good at adding free water, okay? So when we have an increase in the serum sodium concentration, when we're hyperosmolar, the hypothalamus does two things. The first thing it does is it says, hey, we need more free water. Be thirsty. Go out there and get a drink of water. Increase the amount of water coming in. The second thing it does is it releases ADH. And so then you have a decreased amount you're urinating because you're adding water from the urine to the body. These two things together increase the amount of water, the amount of free water, which reduces your osmolality. I forgot I put this little animation. And so you reduce the amount, your concentration of sodium, you reduce your osmolarity, okay? ADH is bad at increasing volume because it doesn't add sodium. But we have something that's good at regulating volume, which is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. I'm seeing a question here in the chat. How does adding/increasing water not increase the volume? I love this question. Okay, this is great. So this is part of the thing that I struggled with that counterintuitive switch. How is it that adding water doesn't increase volume? And the answer is it does increase volume. It's just not very well, right? When you add a liter, let's jump back. When you add a liter of free water, okay, that's going across all of the compartments, you're only getting 8% into the intravascular space. And so it is adding a little bit of volume. It's just not very efficient. You have to reabsorb a liter to get 80 cc's. Whereas, I'm going to walk through what renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system does here. Okay, so renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is good at adding volume. And the reason it's good, so renin-angiotensin 1 and then angiotensin 2, thanks to conversion by ACE in the lungs. So you get angiotensin 2, which works on the proximal convoluted tubule, right? It stimulates the sodium proton antiporter. And because we're permeable to water here, as we move the sodiums, water comes along for the ride. And angiotensin 2 also stimulates the production of aldosterone, which increases the number and activity of the sodium potassium ATPase pumps and the ENaC channel. And so you increase sodium reabsorption. And here, what we're reabsorbing, importantly, has sodium in it, right? Sodium and water, normal saline. And so the benefit of our volume is much more significant, right? Instead of 80 cc's for every liter we're reabsorbing, we get 250 cc's. That's really good volume. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, good. I'm glad. Okay. So renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system adds volume by reabsorbing sodium. Okay. Renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, just said this, adds volume by reabsorbing sodium. Concept number 6. Okay. And to your point, water is not no volume. It's just bad volume, okay? It's distributing across all the compartments. Only 8% remains intravascular, but 8% is not 0%. And if you're volume down, if you have a reduction in effective circulating volume, you want that 8%. And so your hypothalamus says, you know what? I'll take a reduction in my serum osmolality. I don't care about the concentration of stuff. I just need enough fluid in the vessels to perfuse the tissues, right? When my effective circulating volume goes down, and I think the numbers is something like 10%, you suddenly ignore the serum sodium concentration. You ignore your osmolarity, and instead you say, give me that 8%, I'll take it, okay? And as a result, when you have low volumes, you sometimes develop hyponatremia. Okay. Now, in reality, I think this is a great way to think about it in terms of remembering what's going on. But like in reality, and ADH has another name, which is vasopressin, and it's actually it causes pretty significant vasoconstriction, which is going to increase your blood pressure, increase the perfusion pressure. But I think thinking about it this way is saying I'm going to take the hit on my osmolarity because I want volume so badly, and I'll take this bad volume. That's the water. That's not really good volume. That's a great way to remember what's going on here. Okay, great. Taking a look at any questions. So it increases water without changing sodium, right? ADH does, that's right. And is normal saline isotonic? It absolutely is. That's the idea, right? It's isotonic, which means it's not going to change. It's not going to cause any movement of water when you add it to the extracellular space, right? All of the water inside the cells happily remains there. And so it just stays in the extracellular because it is isotonic. Great. Okay. Part 3, disorders of water. So let's talk about how do you get hyponatremia? So normally, we are in a balance. The amount of water we take in and the amount of water we excrete are equal. And so the total free water doesn't change over time. But if you break that balance, so you're bringing in more free water and excreting less, what happens is each day you accumulate more and more free water. And that reduces your serum sodium concentration. It reduces your total osmolality, right? We see the concept increasing water. And it's because the amount in and the amount out are not balanced. So concept number 7, hyponatremia develops when you have more water going in than water coming out. So how does water get into the body? Well, of course, we can drink it. We can also eat it. And certainly if you have like a big piece of watermelon, there's a lot of water in there. But also importantly, carbohydrates that you eat are going to be metabolized ultimately to CO2 and water. The CO2 we just excrete, but the water remains. So eating a bunch of carbs also increases the amount of water you're bringing in. And then finally, you can inject it. And certainly we don't do this to ourselves, unlike eating and drinking, but we do this to patients a lot. And it's pretty important to realize that the amount of fluids we're giving is going to play an important role in the balance of water coming in and going out. On the wards, you'll see people talk a lot about the I's and O's for a patient. In terms of the outs, we can urinate. We've been talking a lot about how the kidney regulates that way. In addition, you have all of the GI losses. I have stool here, but if a patient's vomiting significantly as well, that will increase the amount of water leaving the body. And then there's this third category of the insensible losses. These are things like sweating, the water that evaporates in your lungs as you're adding water to the air you're inhaling. These are sort of harder to measure. Okay, so here's sort of the major things: water coming in, going out. Let's talk first about drinking it. So big slide, hyponatremia mechanism, too much water. The name of this condition is primary polydipsia. This is where you are simply drinking too much water. And I'll let you know, in a healthy adult, the kidney can make a lot of urine. It can make up to 18 liters in a day. That's pretty significant. But I want you to imagine what would happen if, for some reason, oh yeah, here's the 18 liters you can make. But what happens if you were to drink 20 liters of water in a day? Okay, suddenly you're gaining 2 liters of water every day, right? You're bringing in this 20 liters and you're only able to excrete 18. And so every day you're increasing the total body water and you're going to be dropping and developing a hyponatremia, right? But 20 liters, that's a lot of water. And some patients, I think the old term for this was psychogenic polydipsia. If you have an impaired thirst mechanism that's like active all the time, patients can drink 20 liters of water in a day and they will develop a wicked hyponatremia over time. Okay. But let's add a little nuance to that with this question here. So I'll let you know a normal daily solute load is about 700 milliosms. It's typically about 10 milliosms per kilogram, and the canonical 70 kilogram adult. But what I want you to imagine is if you had a patient who's taken in only 300 milliosms of solute every day. Okay. Question is, what's the most amount of urine their kidneys could possibly make? Is it 300 milliliters? Is it 1 liter? Is it 6 liters? pick an answer. And I can tell you the answer is 6 liters. And the reason is that the kidney has got a lower limit on how dilute it can make the urine, right? It can't make it any more dilute than 50 millimoles per liter. And so after 6 liters of urine, if we multiply that 6 liters by our 50 millimoles per liter, we can see we've excreted 300 milliosms, and that's the amount we took in. And because volume always wins, right, you're not going to keep excreting more volume, not going to keep excreting more sodium past your daily solute load. And so you stop making urine at 6 liters because 50 millimoles, the most dilute it can be. And so you have a limited urinary output. Okay. This is the idea here. There is a range. When ADH is activated, we're adding hydration from the urine to the body, which is making the urine concentrated up to like 1,000 milliosms per liter. Okay. Beyond that, it's pretty challenging. I think some animals in the animal kingdom, like the desert mouse, can make like even more concentrated. But for humans, 1,000 or 1,200, that's your like upper limit of concentration. When you suppress ADH, okay, that urine osmolality drops. And if it's maximally suppressed, you can have urine as dilute as 50 milliosms per liter. All right. The collecting duct is impermeable. You're not adding water from the urine to the body. And so you have a pretty dilute urine down to 50, but you can't do better than that. I see a question in the chat here. It seems like 6 liters is a lot with only 300 milliosms. I agree. The kidneys are amazing, right? Getting down to 50 milliosms per liter is pretty dilute, but even with just 300 milliosms, you're able to make up to 6 liters of urine. Okay. So we have this range between 50 milliosms per liter and 1,000 milliosms per liter. So in our normal daily solute load, if you're bringing in 700 milliosms, and you imagine making liters and liters of urine, spending 50 milliosms on each, when you get to 14 liters, you've now spent all of your 700 milliosms because the 14 times 50 milliosms per liter gives you that 700 milliosms. In contrast, if you're making maximally concentrated urine with those 700 milliosms, you're only going to make 700 mLs, right, at that maximum concentration. Okay. So concept 8, urine osmolality has a range. The most concentrated it can be is 1,000 milliosms or millimoles per liter, and the most dilute it can be is 50 millimoles per liter. I'm seeing a question in the chat about units. I wouldn't worry too much about units, millimoles, milliosms. The one weird one is milliequivalent, refers to charge, and so a mole of calcium has 2 milliequivalents, but I don't worry too much about, just sort of focus on the numbers. The units will tend to work out here. And as well as distinguishing between osmolarity and osmolality, it's not that relevant most of the time. I think if you want to go to nephrology, you'll probably want to make sure you have that done pretty consistently. So there's our second hyponatremia mechanism. Too much water, like the first, but here we have not enough solute. And so the amount of too much water we need is less. Let's talk about that in detail. The 2 pathologies here are beer drinkers potomania and tea and toast syndrome. So imagine you took in 5 liters of water or beer in a day, but because of your diet, because you're only drinking tea and eating toast, you're getting like no salt, so you only have 200 milliosms of solute going in. Okay, let's make some urine with our maximally dilute, right? We know we're in a hyponatremia picture, and so we're trying to release ADH trying to suppress ADH rather. So it's very easy to mix those up. You're trying to suppress ADH to avoid adding water from the urine to the body so you can get rid of your free water. And so now we start making urine at 50 milliosms per liter. We make one that gets us to 50. We make a second liter that gets us to 100. We make a third that gets us to 150 milliosms spent. And when we make our 4th liter, we've run out. We just spent all, so we can only make 4 liters of urine. And what that means is every day we're gaining a liter of water. And pretty quickly, we're going to develop a wicked hyponatremia. And importantly, these folks have their ADH maximally suppressed because they are hyponatremic. They're trying to dump their water. They're euvolemic, right? Because volume is winning. So ADH is turned off. If you give them a liter of normal saline, what you've given them is 300 extra milliosms to work with. And so they'll take those 300 milliosms in that liter of normal saline, and they will make with that 6 liters of dilute urine. And so what you'll see is you give them a little bit of normal saline, and they have a brisk diuresis of free water, right? They're just peeing and peeing and peeing all that extra free water out. And what's going to happen is their sodium is going to spike. It's going to go from 121 to 138, and they're going to demyelinate. So in these patients with beer drinkers potomania and tea and toast, it's essential to be very cautious about the solute load you give them. You want to give them solute so that they can get rid of their extra free water and correct the hyponatremia, but you want to do it slowly so that they don't suddenly, because their kidney doesn't know any better. The ADH is turned off. It's just going to filter, just going to risk free water diuresis them straight into osmotic demyelination syndrome. Okay, checking for questions here. Okay. I think we're going to hold off on, there's a couple questions in the chat, but I think they're probably better addressed later. So let's move on here. Okay. We talked about times where you're having too much water coming in. Let's talk about times where you're not having enough water going out. So one is, of course, if you have renal failure, if you're not making any urine, you're not going to get any of the water out. And so patients who are about to get dialysis often are trending towards hyponatremia. But more relevant, I think, in terms of answering questions on exams and things, is the times when you have too much ADH. Like you saw last block with your SIADH case. Okay, what happens there? In too much ADH, you're adding too much water to the body from the urine, and so you're not able, any water you bring in is going to get stuck in the body because your kidneys are due to this excess ADH stuck making concentrated urine. You're not able to get rid of that. There's no way your solute load could keep up. And so you develop a hyponatremia. Just briefly here, I think you talked about it last block, and we'll talk about it a little bit as we go through the algorithm. But a brief aside before we jump into the algorithm I have to present to you. Remember way back to the beginning of this talk, why is it that we care about hyponatremia? The reason we care is that sodium concentration tells us what the osmolality of the body is, okay? Hyponatremia is really, when it's significant, it's a problem of low serum osmolality. And we know changes in osmolality change how water moves, and so you can have problems like in the brain and in cells. But does hyponatremia always mean low serum osmolality? Unfortunately, no. There are exceptions. And so what do we call it when the serum sodium concentration lies to us? That is deemed pseudo-hyponatremia. I'm just going to talk about it briefly. I think we discussed it at length in the lecture, and so, and frankly, in terms of fitting in conceptually with the rest of what we're trying to talk about today, I don't think it's as important. Okay, part 5, the algorithm. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go through the algorithm for hyponatremia, and I'm going to talk briefly about each of the diagnoses. But again, each of these are things that you could spend a long time learning about in depth. So it's not going to be too extensive. We've been going for a while here, but I want to make sure you have this and understand the ideas behind it. So hyponatremia. First step when you see a low serum sodium concentration is to make sure that you're dealing with a real hyponatremia and that it's not one of these pseudo hyponatremias or due to some other thing. So the first thing you're going to measure is the serum osmolality. Okay. That is why we care about hyponatremia. That serum osmolality can either be low, normal, or high. If it's low, that's our real hyponatremia. That's when we're going to go down the rest of the algorithm. When it's normal, this is our pseudo hyponatremia. And there are two causes of this: elevations in lipids or in proteins. And the key idea here is that that low value on the serum sodium is a complete lab error. It's just the way they run the machine to measure a serum sodium. It requires them to put in this information about what the non-soluble component is. And when you have too many lipids or too many proteins, that number ends up being wrong. And so they dilute the sample incorrectly, right? It's just like an artifact of the way you're measuring the serum sodium. So that's truly pseudo hyponatremia. The thing you have to do in that case is figure out, why are the lipids so high, or why are the proteins so high, right? Do they have some kind of like multiple myeloma or Waldenstrom's that's causing that high level of protein? Okay. If the serum osmolality is high, that is typically because of hyperglycemia. Okay, patient with diabetes has got a glucose of 400 or 500. That glucose can't get into the cells because insulin's not working properly, and so it exerts that osmotic pull on water from inside the cells, which pulls the water into the extracellular compartment, right? Here, all of the things we normally think about with hyponatremia in terms of having excess free water, it's backwards because they are actually hyperosmolar. So instead, you have to treat the hyperglycemia. Let's now talk about our low serum osmolality, our hypotonic hyponatremia, the true hyponatremia. Okay. The next step in this case, when we see that serum osm is low, is to say, all right, I want to know, is this a problem about urinary excretion of free water or about oral intake of free water? And the way we answer that is by trying to answer the question, is ADH turned on or not? Okay. The way you answer that is by looking at the concentration of the urine. So in the case that ADH is turned on, we're adding hydration from the urine to the body. And so the urine is going to be concentrated. So it's going to have a high osmolarity, something like over 100. Okay. And when it has a low concentration, when it's a dilute urine, we know that ADH is turned off. It's being suppressed. So under that category, we have our primary polydipsia, our beer drinkers potomania, and tea and toast syndrome, like we talked about, right? They would, because ADH is suppressed, the kidney would be happily excreting more free water, but it can't because, for example, there's not enough solute load to be able to create that volume of urine. Okay. They have these other two on here, the You Fixed It and Reset Osmostat. I wouldn't worry too much about those. That's, again, something you can dive into. There's some good stuff on UpToDate about it, but the conceptually fitting into the picture is going to be that primary polydipsia and beer drinkers, tea and toast. Okay, but now we have this other category. When we get the urine osmolarity and we see that it's elevated, and so we say, wow, despite this patient's hyponatremia, which normally we'd expect to turn off ADH, ADH is turned on for some reason. Okay, and when we want to break those into categories of the times that ADH is turned on despite having low serum osmolality, we do this by volume status. Okay, so you do a volume status exam on the patient, famously not very effective. There's some like more interesting stuff you can do by looking at the urine sodium, but let's not talk about that now. Let's instead just conceptually into 3 categories of volume status. You can be either hypovolemic, euvolemic, or hypervolemic. And you know, as I added that, I added this euvolemic category under the hypoosmolar urine when ADH is turned off, right? Because their volume status should be appropriate. There's no reason that would be wrong, right? Their renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system is working exactly the way it was designed to, so they're euvolemic. But here, the volume status is intimately tied to the reason ADH is turned on, which is causing the hyponatremia. Okay, it's that ADH being turned on that is why these patients are hyponatremic. So first we have the hypovolemic, and like we talked about, there are 2 triggers for ADH, either an increase in serum osmolality or a decrease in effective circulating volume, right? That decrease greater than 10%. So if you have reasons to have lost volume, GI losses, vomiting, diarrhea, really significant sweating, if you're taking a thiazide diuretic, or if you have aldosterone deficiency, so you're not appropriately reabsorbing in the collecting duct, okay, all of these things cause you to have a low total body sodium and a low intravascular volume, which turns on ADH and makes you add water, which dilutes the sodium, giving you the hyponatremia. I'm seeing a question in the chat about loop diuretics, like the question is, why is it that loop diuretics don't cause hyponatremia? It's a great question. It's not that important, but it's a great question. It's kind of interesting. The reason is because of the way ADH works in terms of reabsorbing water. So loop diuretics block NKCC in the thick ascending limb. And what that means is you can no longer establish a very concentrated medullary interstitium. It's part of the reason loop diuretics are so effective, in fact, is because they mess up the kidney's concentrating ability. What happens is you end up having to just excrete more salt. And so when you have ADH turned on, in the case of a patient who's taking lots of loop diuretics, you insert those aquaporin channels into the collecting duct, but there's no concentration gradient. You don't reabsorb a whole bunch of free water. You don't develop hyponatremia. Your urine, in fact, looks isoosmolar. It looks like maybe 300. Okay. That's what's going on with the loop diuretics versus thiazides, which don't mess that up at all. Happily, you continue reabsorbing free water due to your volume depletion from the thiazide diuretic. The next category here is the hypervolemic causes. I always remembered this as the big three: congestive heart failure, cirrhosis, and nephrosis. In reality, nephrotic syndrome is not super strongly associated with hyponatremia, but you do get a little volume overload. But in these, really, especially congestive heart failure and cirrhosis, the problem is that while your total body sodium is high, your hypervolemic, your extracellular space is larger, you're for some reason not perfusing well. So your effective circulating volume is down. And to the kidney, that's just the same as being low volume, right? It's not getting the perfusion pressure it expects. And so the system's in place to have you reabsorb sodium, and to the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, all of it saying, hey, bring in some stuff. And in fact, ADH gets activated here as well, right? You think your effective circulating volume is down 10%, ADH gets turned on, even though you've got this tremendously expanded interstitium. Okay, so that's what's going on in your hypervolemic. It's like the hypovolemic. It just, your actual volume is up, but your body thinks the volume's down. Okay, looks like we're good there. Euvolemic. This is the final category here. I organized these on a little stick figure. So we have SIADH, which is coming from the hypothalamus, hypothyroidism, which is coming from the thyroid, and a glucocorticoid deficiency, which we're not going to talk about too much. So SIADH, that is just the primary problem, is you're making ADH when you shouldn't. And remember, in the hypovolemic and hypervolemic, that ADH, while it's messing up your serum sodium, it's like actually adaptive, right? It's kind of appropriate, because we know ADH causes vasoconstriction. ADH gives us this inefficient, we're getting that 80 cc's per liter of water, but it's not nothing. And so it's there for a reason. In SIADH, there's no reason to be releasing ADH. It's something like you have lung cancer that's making ADH, that's causing you to reduce your urine output, to take that free water back into the body, and developing a hyponatremia. Hypothyroid, you're going to talk about that next block in endorepro. I'll tell you, not that GI, down the road in endorepro. So, but I'll tell you the story here. Normally, your thyroid makes thyroid hormone, and it does that when it's told to by TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which is released from the pituitary gland. When do you make TSH? You make TSH when thyrotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus tells the pituitary to tell the thyroid to make thyroid hormone. When the thyroid's not working, thyroid gland is not working properly, you don't make thyroid hormone, and so you lose the feedback inhibition, and so you increase TRH and TSH. And the thing about TRH is that when it's released, you just happen to release ADH at the same time. They're co-released. And so it's this big increase in TRH that causes elevations in ADH. And this is really in severe hypothyroidism, like myxedema coma, pretty uncommon. But there you go. That's what's going on there. Glucocorticoid deficiency, I'm not going to talk about too much either. I think the same idea. You have this. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Questions on this algorithm? Okay. I think we're doing pretty well here. Looking to get the slide, looking to get a copy of the slides again. So let me pull that up for you. Here's a reminder of all the stuff we talked about. Oh, great. Thank you, Andy. So Andy has there published the QR code. It's also on the screen here. I think we're going to end a formal presentation here. Oh, I've almost completely forgot. Before everyone goes, I want to make sure you know where to look for next steps, and also where I have taken a lot of the ideas from this firm. So there's this fantastic guy, Dr. Joel Toff, Kidney Boy on Twitter, who I think explains this stuff way better. He's got this great book here. It's in the slides. If you click on the link, preciousvitalfluids.com/the electrolyte book. Really, really fantastic. But I think like he appeared on an episode of Curbsiders, episode number 48, Hyponatremia Deconstructed. They sort of chat a little bit for the first 12-15 minutes, but then he starts going through this approach to hyponatremia. I think this should be like required listening. So this is your next step, is to listen to this episode and continue to expand your knowledge. If you want a deeper dive on these concepts, the founder of UpToDate is this guy named Dr. Burton Rose, Bud Rose, who sadly has passed away. But he wrote this phenomenal book called The Clinical Physiology of Acid-Base and Electrolyte Disorders. And it goes through, it's a pretty old book, I think like from the 70s or 80s, but it is phenomenal. And it goes through all this stuff sort of from first principles. Would recommend if you want a deeper dive. And then the PDFs available online. And then finally, Clinical Problem Solvers have put together these excellent schemata. There's a link here. And they have one for hyponatremia that includes this distinction using the urinary sodium to tell if what your volume status is. But there you go. So thank you everyone for coming and for enjoying this talk. I hope it was helpful. And keep getting after it.